Welcome to Ceasefire, where civics meets civility and engagement meets empowerment. Ceasefire is hosted by former Boerne ISD trustee and owner of the Boerne Bookshop, Dale Adams, and by former Boerne City Council member and local insurance agent, Ron Cisneros.
Welcome to Ceasefire. This is Dale Adams.
And I'm Ron Cisneros.
And welcome back, everybody, to our show, brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop. Today, we've got a special one. We're going to talk about the Second Amendment.
That's right. And this is a continuation of an episode we did a couple episodes back. We were talking about a survey about Americans' knowledge of the Constitution and their rights. And Dale and I decided that we were going to cover the first 10 amendments. And we kind of touched on the first one on that one episode, and I think we'll go back to that and revisit it and talk about some of the rights that are listed in the First Amendment. But I thought, let's take a deep dive into the Second Amendment to kind of kick things off, because that's a controversial one. It's
exciting.
Yeah. And I don't know that it should be. There was an interesting article, and I was trying to find it. I'd read it sometime last year in the Wall Street Journal, about Democrats and liberals and people of the left who are now advocating for gun rights. And it was interesting. I read the article, and mostly they were hunters and people like that just were firearms instructors. But as you'd expect, they talked about sensible gun control, which I always thought, well, who decides what sensible is? I didn't buy what they were selling that day in that article, but it was still interesting. So there's a push from that side, a little bit, a small one, to look at or have a sort of pro-Second Amendment perspective, which I think is healthy.
I think so, too. So, but first, for those of you out there who've been living under a rock for the last 250 years and don't know what the Second Amendment is, I'm going to read it to you. It says that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And every word of that has been argued and debated and gone over with a fine-tooth comb. Today we're going to do something similar, but I don't think we're going to do the minutia that some people like to get caught up in.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things I see this discussion as, I should call it a discussion, not a debate. I mean, people always debate it, but it really should be a discussion, is there's actually three discussions. There's the historical discussion.
Mm-hmm.
What do they mean? Where did it come from? Blah, 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 blah. There's the semantic discussion, which is, well, what does it say? And what does that comma mean? And why isn't there another comma there or something like that? And there's the third discussion that I think is actually the most important, that should be done first, which is the conceptual discussion. What does it mean conceptually? And do we agree on any of those, the aspects of that conception? And this sort of gets back to when we talked about that survey that nobody knew what the rights were that were in the First Amendment. And I commented that people feel it in American culture. It's part of our culture. They may not know that it's articulated in the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or whatever amendment, but they feel that very deeply and strongly. And I think that the conceptual argument is better to have, because that brings out the cultural understanding and implications for having this right. And so that's sort of the arena that I like to discuss, rather than the historical or the semantic.
Okay. It's always great when we put our show together, because Dale runs off, he writes down his notes, I write down my notes, and we told each other we're never going to share our notes because we want to come in there and have this normal conversation. And so I come in here with all these notes. I wish you could see these stack of papers.
It's very organized.
Yeah, Lexi's trying to get me to come in with less notes, but we'll see. And
I'm ahead of the curve on.
But it's funny because I've got all of my notes, and then I just heard Dale say his little introduction there, and I'm like, darn it, I like what he wants to talk about way better than what I want to talk about. Now my notes won't do me any good, but that's all right.
But they're good because they provide the backdrop for a lot of our discussions, and you'll be able to pull up some of the data, details, and important things that we need to know in order to have conceptual discussion.
Let's hope.
I'm always hoping.
Well, kick us off.
Okay, well, I think conceptually, the Second Amendment discusses our right to protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of where I like to go with this. And some people say, well, we have our government to protect us, or we have our local police or whatever. And I say, yeah, we do. And that's great. But I want to go deeper than that. It comes down to the right to life. And what's the point of having the right to live at all if you can't struggle to improve your life or to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
Your existence is dependent on somebody else and not on your own ability to make sure that you continue to exist. Then you really don't have a right to life.
Well, their response might be, well, Dale, I'm just worried about the gun violence in the United States. It seems to increase year after year, and I don't feel safe anymore.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Well, I could try and dig up stats and data and talk about anecdotes about people, or I could just say, you know what? We are humans. We live in the world. There is violence in the world. And yes, it sucks, but that's just sort of part of life. Trying to eliminate it is not going to happen, for starters. It's never going to happen. In putting so much effort into trying to eliminate the bad things in our world, you're never going to get to zero. It's just never going to happen. But the struggle seems to be there. And we've had declines in all kinds of violence, which has been a good thing. But this is not about violence. It's about a right. And it's just like the right to free speech. Yes, okay, so if we have free speech, well, what if somebody tells a lie about me? Well, yeah, that's bad. But you can't not let somebody speak because they may lie.
Right.
So I would say you can't tell somebody they can't defend themselves because they may hurt somebody.
Right.
So for me, it comes down to a right to life.
So speaking of statistics, because I was thinking in that general area, big surprise, I was thinking about the term gun violence and how we don't have things like, or we don't have terms like bat violence, right? Like baseball bat violence.
Yeah.
We don't talk about knife violence. We don't talk about fist violence. We talk about gun violence.
Yeah.
We've taken this inanimate object and we've animated it, and somehow it is the culprit. But I want to do a little history refresher here and bring up three incidences. And I could bring up a whole lot more, but these are three in particular that I think are sort of etched in our memory. And one is the Boston Marathon bombing, which used pressure cookers. Another one was the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people, and that used fertilizer. And then another one, and this one goes way back to 1927, and this one's probably been forgotten by a lot of folks, but this was the Bath school bombing. And this was a guy that ended up killing 43 students and then his wife, so 44 people in all. And with the school bombing, he used dynamite and gasoline. So, and I should say that he did use a rifle to set off the dynamite from a distance.
Oh, then that's gun violence.
Yeah, well, so I guess, yeah. And I'm going to come
The only
around to
thing that
this.
counts in that whole thing
Is the
gun.
rifle, right? Yeah. But the capacity for violence doesn't exist solely with the gun, the handgun or the rifle. It is in the human heart.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think that there's an ulterior motive for people who want to take away gun rights. And it has nothing to do with gun violence and everything to do with, I think, the ability to take away our rights to defend ourselves against the government.
And that's probably the biggest reason why it's actually in our constitutional Bill of Rights,
Right.
is that the historical purpose of it is to protect us from the federal government.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to share something else with you, too, if I may. I was curious about school shootings because that's another reason. Well, there's this great increase in school shootings year after year, and so we've got to do something about it. And we've never had this problem historically prior to, say, I think they usually say 1970 or so.
Yeah, hit and runs are way up too. Yeah.
Right.
You got to take away the cars.
So I looked at school shootings from the very first recorded one in the United States. And you want to take a gander at when you think that was recorded?
Late 1700s? I mean, I'm sure they've existed.
1764 was the first recorded historical incidence of gun violence in a school, and it was perpetrated by some Delaware Indians who broke into one of those old-fashioned schoolhouses. They killed the teacher, scalped him, and then killed 10 students, but with clubs. They beat them to death and scalped them as well. That was the first incident. And so in the 1700s, in the totality of the 1700s, you had one. The next one didn't happen until 1840, and a law professor was shot by a student. And then I went through and I looked at every decade, and you go from, 3 in the 1850s, and then 5, 7, 10. And then you do see at a point in the 1960s, we have 20. In the 1970s, 50. In the 1980s, 78. In the 1990s, 123. Then it drops in the 2000s.
This is per year?
This is per decade.
Per decade, okay.
Yeah, and then it goes to 85 in the 2000s. And then you have this incredible jump in the 2010s. It goes to 266.
From 85.
Yeah, from 85, the decade prior.
And the decade before that was
123.
Huh.
And then from 2020 to 2024, in the 2020s, what we're in now, the last 4 years, 226. But here's something interesting, is that if you go down, and you can find this online, and you break down each incident, you'll find out that sometimes it's a school resource officer accidentally shooting his firearm. Sometimes it's like in one case, it was a woman who was killed by her ex-husband as she was leaving school grounds and they were in a dispute. Sometimes it's coworkers. There are cases here of teachers shooting the principal.
So you really got to pull out the details of the data.
Yes. And when you look at it, then you start to find out that a few times it's, student on student, which is what we normally think of. We hear school shooting, but the government is compiling all this data, and they're saying if a school resource officer accidentally fires his weapon, or if somebody happens to be on the grounds after hours and they shoot out some windows at the school, they call that a school shooting. Right. And so we don't have record of that in the 1850s or the 1900s. It's something they've started doing recently.
So you think some of it may be just expanding the scope of what they include in the data?
Yes, to form a narrative.
Yeah.
Lexi?
I mean, it's true, but that's with almost everything. It's whatever is going to get people to be paranoid. It's going to be whatever the news wants to put out there to get people to panic and to go back on protecting yourself from the government. I mean, the government is then putting restrictions on police forces for what they can do to help you. So if you're relying only on the police, they're getting restricted now.
Mm-hmm.
It's to the point where you can only fend for yourself. A bad guy is going to get whatever they want no matter what. If you're banning cocaine, they're still going to be able to get cocaine and sell it on the street.
Right.
Point blank. You can ban it all you want. You can make it harder for good people to defend themselves and then have to rely on police or the government. And that's exactly what they want. But in turn, people need to just see that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point you brought about the drugs and people getting those things. Is society is sort of split into I don't know what you even call it, the legal, normal, day-to-day society that we're all part of. Well, everybody's part of both of them a little bit. And then you have sort of the darker side, which is where it's sort of outside the law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the drug trades, the trafficking, all that kind of stuff happens in a different society, but it's part of our society also. But there's like two of these societies. And I guess what I get from you is that you can't get rid of that dark side. It's always going to be there.
Always going to be there.
So we're responsible for ourselves in relation to that. Yeah.
I think we're up for a break.
Are we already?
I know.
Time to pay the bills.
Oh, okay. This is Dale and Ron with Ceasefire, brought to you by the Boerne Bookshop. We'll take a quick break here and be back in just a minute. Boerne has its own bookshop. In fact, it's called the Boerne Bookshop. Hi, I'm Dale Adams, inviting you to get lost. Get lost in a good book in our relaxed and casual atmosphere. We have a wide and eclectic selection in the Boerne Bookshop, and we pride ourselves on finding what you are looking for. We do author meet and greets, host writing workshops, and can connect you with a good book club. And your young ones will absolutely love our kids section at the Boerne Bookshop. And while we want you to get lost, we're easy to find, as we're in the heart of Boerne at the back of the Richter Tavern building. We are the Boerne Bookshop. Welcome back to Ceasefire with Dale and Ron. We've been talking about the Second Amendment. We need to sort of pick up the pace because there's a lot to go over, and I've only covered one thing on my list.
I liked where we finished off right before the break, and I think what Lexi was talking about is very similar to what we were talking about in our last show when we were talking about fear, that sort of irrational fear that drives us. And I just find that very interesting because I think that's what is at root here in our conversation about guns.
Yeah.
Very often.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from not knowing about guns. In the case of a lot of people, we've been taught to be afraid of guns so much in the last 50 years or so that people are very scared of guns. And that's unfortunate, just like some people are afraid of driving. And both of those things, I think, are things that everybody should understand, have an understanding from. They used to teach driving in high school, and then they stopped because it's not in the TEKS and the state doesn't help pay for it. And so schools just sort of stopped doing that. And honestly, I wish the schools would get back to that so we'd have better drivers. But I also wish the schools would teach firearm safety. That may be kind of radical, but what better place would it be to have training than under a supervised instructor that would teach everybody the rights and the wrongs about how to handle a firearm? Now, these people may never handle a firearm, but at least they understand it.
Right.
And so I would like to see everybody learn about firearms and understand them, just like I want them to understand how to drive, even if they're never going to drive, or how to cook,
Right.
even if they're never going to cook. And all these different things are such important parts of our society that people shy away from. I mean, doing a checkbook. We talk a lot about, in the school boards, we're always talking about how kids need to learn the basics of doing a checkbook and having a job and all this other kind of stuff. I throw firearms in there with that group too.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'm in the insurance business, and basically I sell risk aversion, right? But there's never such a thing as complete risk aversion. You can't buy a health insurance policy or a disability income insurance policy without some acceptance of risk. The insurance company doesn't allow you to push all of the risk onto their side of the table. There's a balance somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some risk aversion and risk acceptance. And I look at firearms in the same way. I'm not going to ask anybody to own one that doesn't want to own one, but I would ask them to have an understanding of the mechanics of it and how to operate one safely should you ever encounter one, right? And I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah. And not to say, to somebody else, well, you can't have it because I'm afraid of it.
Right.
It's the same thing as saying, well, you can't say that because I don't like it. Right?
Yeah.
It's the imposition of our will on somebody else.
And unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get to that place because the respect factor is it's not there. Everyone's going to have a different opinion about one thing. And unfortunately, whatever side you're on, they're going to say, no, you're wrong. Depending on your state that you're in, like I used to live in Seattle, if looking back at COVID, I chose not to get a vaccine shot. They wouldn't respect the fact that I don't want to have that shot. So instead, they take away certain rights of, well, then you can't come in here. You can't do this. You can't do that. So it's not even just firearms, unfortunately. It's going to be any single matter that is a major topic that no one's going to be able to respect what other people think and what they want to do.
I hope that's not the case, because then this show is pointless.
I wish, 100% wish that was the case. And if we were in a perfect world, that would be. But I think we are the closest in comparing most countries to get to that point. Yeah. And I think we can get closer like we were in previous years going back in history. But to compare to other countries, I definitely think we are higher up in that.
Oh, yeah.
But to be completely perfect and we're all in, in harmony together, that's just not going to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think your point about respecting the individual decision is a huge factor in, not only was it in COVID, but also with firearms, is that our government naturally has a tendency to not want to respect the decisions of individuals. That's why democracies have to be constantly reinforced and supported by the people, because governments want to make the decisions for people.
Exactly.
And that's driven by a lack of respect for the individual decision. And honestly, firearms is a big part of that. And when you have a firearm, well, people have to respect you a little bit, or pretend to anyway. Yeah. And I think that's one of the big debates, is that people want the government to respect them. And if we can't get them to do it naturally, we can just say, look, you've got to respect the people with the guns. I mean, that might be a kind of a blunt way to put it, but
no. But if every single person was walking around, and every single person was carrying a gun, do you know how much less gun violence there would truly be? Because someone's not going to go in a store and go, I'm going to try to rob this place, I'm putting a gun to someone's head, then you're going to have 20 people turn around and also have a gun on them, go straight back at you.
The counter to that argument, though, I'm going to play devil's advocate, is that, now you've got 20 people who might not know how to handle a weapon that are all firing handguns.
Yeah.
And to that, I will counter the counter and say, well, I could show you a video that just recently in the news of a police officer who shot at a man that went to pick up, his car was stopped on the highway, and he got out to pick up his hat, which had, I guess, blown out of the vehicle. And the policeman thought that the man was pulling a gun, and he shot at him. And so, there's this argument that, well, only people of authority should have handguns, but they are also fully capable of making mistakes.
Right.
Oh, 100%. And I think that goes back to the topic of fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What has that cop seen so many times over and over?
Right.
Yeah.
People going right back. And the purpose I brought up the conversation of if everyone had a handgun on them, what's the probability of it? If that was the case, what would have been the probability that person would have even pulled out a gun in the first place? It would be lower.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can try to go off statistics all you want, but in an honest situation, that person, if they were trying to put one thought together with another thought, they'll come up with a conclusion of, this is probably not a good idea, and we're not going to do this.
Yeah.
They might try something different, but them pulling out a gun is going to be less compared to if they know that the probability of someone in that store probably is lower compared to, I know for sure that everyone in that store has a gun on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Gun shows don't have a whole lot of gun violence, do they?
No.
I've
No,
heard
they
a lot of
don't.
it. Yeah.
Y'all remember how we got here in Texas to where we are now, the sort of genesis of our gun rights getting stronger in the state started with an incident in Killeen at a Luby's, where a madman drove his car into a Luby's, and then in the ensuing chaos started shooting people and killing them. And one lady who lost her parents in that heinous crime started pushing for the right to carry a gun in the state of Texas. 'Cause prior to that, you could have one in your car if you were traveling from your home to some other place. You couldn't carry one on your person, like we do now. It's hard to believe that we used to live that way in Texas.
Yeah.
And that was in the 90s, if I remember correctly.
80s maybe.
Yeah, maybe the late 80s.
Yeah.
Can't remember.
I think a lot of what we're talking about, or what Lexi's talking about specifically, is something that Robert Heinlein once said and actually used in his book. And he said that an armed society is a polite society.
Amen.
And a lot of that just, it's about the balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
When you have everybody being equally powerful, it's hard for other people, bullies, oppressors, anybody, to exert physical force on another person. And so you tend to sort of have a more balanced society. And I think a lot of our struggles against guns increases the imbalance of power, because you have people with the guns, legally or not, and those that don't. And it's particularly in a lot of our inner cities, those with the guns tend to prey upon those that don't.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Last year in San Antonio, the number of dog attacks on humans jumped up to the point where the city started talking about it and saying, hey, we got to do something about this. What I find curious about that, you'll read about dog violence at times, and usually the cure is a leash law. Not the elimination of dogs. Nobody ever argues that we need to have dog control other than a leash.
Yeah.
Gun control is usually, they say sensible gun control, but we're going to take away AR-15s. Nobody needs an AR-15.
Right.
Now, sometimes we might argue against a particular breed, but then animal lovers will come back and say, it's not the breed. It's the owner.
The user.
That's
Yeah,
the
it's the
user.
user.
Right. Well, why is it the owner of the dog that's ultimately responsible, but it's not the owner of the handgun or the operator of the handgun?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this goes back to what I said at the beginning of the show, is that we want to animate an inanimate object.
We do. And speaking of that, if you want to be able to take care of your inanimate object, at the Boerne Bookshop, we've got a book called The Shooter's Bible, and I think a lot of you have probably heard of this. And this particular one's the Guide to Firearms Assembly, Disassembly, and Cleaning, written by Robert Sadowski and it's sort of a classic in the firearms world. It's been around for quite a while. Actually, they've got several different books, different guides and stuff like that. But we've got a couple of them at the Boerne Bookshop if you want to stop in and pick one up. So anybody that's not getting enough of us can just come back, and next Tuesday, I will be debating school choice. Should be a fascinating discussion. It'll be 6:30 in the evening at the Boerne Public Library. Just stop in, and I will be discussing the merits of school choice, and my opponent will be discussing the cons of school choice.
Hey, folks, if you like what you hear on the show and you want to get some more of it, Dale and I would like to invite you to Whiskey and Wisdom, a new book club that started late last year, and we meet every other month on the third Thursday. Our next meeting will be February 20th. Please join us. We're going to have an assortment of whiskeys there and a great conversation about a very interesting book, a lot of the topics that we've talked about on this show. Hope to see you there.
And I think that's going to wrap it up for Ceasefire today with Dale and Ron. And we will see you next week. If you missed part of this, you can always check out our podcast at boerneradio.com.
We'll see you all next week.